I'll make sure your career ends here. Even if you're innocent, I'll make you pay." Those words didn't come from an enemy. They came from my SEAL Admiral, the man who trained me, mentored me, and once called me the future of command. And as security dragged me out of that briefing room, every eye in that room turned away, like loyalty suddenly had a price tag. He slipped a fabricated file into HQ records that night, burying my name under his lies. But what he never knew was that fate had already reassigned me. 2 days later, he would stand before the one officer he couldn't manipulate, me, his assigned evaluator. And when our eyes finally met across that table, he didn't see the woman he tried to destroy. He saw the commander who would write his end. Before I show you what happened when the truth walked back into that room, please like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from, because sometimes the sweetest justice is served in silence. You want to know about betrayal? Real betrayal? Let me tell you about the kind that comes wrapped in a flag and delivered by someone you'd die for. The kind that tears through your chest like shrapnel and leaves you bleeding trust all over the floor of a briefing room while grown men look away like cowards. I started as nobody. A data technician buried in the basement of naval intelligence, running numbers and cross-referencing files that most people never even knew existed. 12-hour shifts in a windowless room, living off black coffee and the belief that what I was doing mattered. That's where he found me, Admiral Richard Cole, 3 stars gleaming on his collar, walking through our division like he owned the air we breathed. But here's the thing about being invisible. You see everything. Every slight, every preference, every moment when someone's mask slips just enough to show you who they really are underneath all that brass and polish. I saw how he treated the men differently than the women, how his smile never quite reached his eyes when he was talking to someone he considered beneath him, how he collected loyalty like trophies and discarded people the moment they stopped being useful. I should have seen it coming. The way his jaw would tighten when I'd correct his data analysis, the flash of something dark behind his eyes when other officers would seek my input instead of his. But I was young, and I was hungry, and when he pulled me out of that basement and offered me a chance at real advancement, I thought I'd won the lottery. I thought he saw something in me worth developing. "Martinez," he'd say, that practiced smile spreading across his weathered face, "you've got the mind for strategy that most of these boys could never dream of. Stick with me, and I'll make sure you rise faster than anyone expects." And God help me, I believed him. When he recommended me for accelerated promotion, when he personally endorsed my application for advanced tactical training, when he stood before the entire command staff and called me his prototype for the future of leadership, I thought I was living a dream. I'd lost my father to a classified mission when I was 17. Helicopter went down over terrain so sensitive they couldn't even tell us where. Just a flag, a medal, and a form letter thanking our family for his service. Admiral Cole knew that story. He knew about the hole in my chest where trust used to live, and he filled it with his attention, his approval, his promises of a legacy that would make my father proud. He became the mentor I'd never had, the father figure I'd been desperately seeking in the rigid hierarchy of military life. But here's what I learned about pride. It's a cancer that eats everything good in a man from the inside out. His pride couldn't stand watching me rise faster than his golden boys, the ones he'd handpicked and groomed for years before I even walked through those doors. It burned him alive every time I solved a problem they couldn't, every time my analysis proved more accurate than theirs, every time someone asked for my opinion instead of deferring to his chosen successors. I thought I'd earned his respect. Turns out, I'd threatened his ego. The signs were all there if I'd been smart enough to read them. The way meetings would suddenly reschedule when my name was on the agenda. How my reports started getting lost in administrative review. The subtle shift in how other officers interacted with me, like they'd received some invisible signal to keep their distance. But I was so focused on proving myself, so determined to honor the faith he'd shown in me, that I missed the knife sliding between my ribs until it was already buried to the hilt. They didn't arrest me for what I'd done. They arrested me for what he feared I'd become. The morning it happened, I was reviewing intelligence reports from a joint operation in the Mediterranean. Routine work, the kind of careful analysis I'd been doing for months without incident. That's when they came, security personnel with stone faces and silence that spoke louder than any accusation. No explanation, no warning, just the cold metallic click of handcuffs and the suffocating weight of every stare in that briefing room. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, the security chief, read from his tablet like he was announcing the weather. "You're under investigation for unauthorized disclosure of classified intelligence during Operation Neptune's Gate." The words hit like artillery shells, each one tearing through everything I thought I knew about my life, my career, my future. Operation Neptune's Gate, the mission I hadn't even been briefed on, the operation that took place while I was on medical leave recovering from a training injury. But there it was, printed in black and white, signed and dated with all the official stamps that make lies look like truth. My signature on documents I'd never seen, my security code linked to data transfers I'd never authorized, my name buried under an avalanche of evidence so perfectly constructed it could have been a masterpiece if it weren't destroying my life. He stood there watching it all unfold, Admiral Cole with his practiced expression of shock and disappointment, playing his part like the consummate actor he'd always been. When our eyes met across that briefing room, I saw something flicker behind his gaze, not guilt, not regret, but satisfaction. The cold, calculated satisfaction of a man who'd just executed a flawless operation. "I'm sorry you have to see this, Richard," he said to the investigating officer, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "Martinez was one of my most promising officers. I never would have suspected." He let the words hang in the air like smoke, poisoning every relationship I'd built, every bridge I'd crossed, every hand I'd shaken in that room. The humiliation was designed to be public, calculated to be complete. They walked me past every desk, every office, every face I'd worked alongside for months. Some looked away in embarrassment, others stared with the morbid fascination of people watching a car wreck. But the worst part, the part that still burns like acid in my memory, was seeing the relief in some of their eyes. Relief that it wasn't them, relief that the target had been someone else, relief that they could return to their safe little worlds of following orders and keeping their heads down. As security dragged me out of that briefing room, every eye in that room turned away, like loyalty suddenly had a price tag, and I'd just been marked down for clearance. That night, while I sat in a holding cell waiting for a lawyer I couldn't afford and facing charges I couldn't understand, he was at his desk forging the final pieces of my downfall. Digital timestamps altered with surgical precision, security logs modified to place me at locations I'd never been, witness statements crafted from conversations that had never happened. He worked through the night like a man possessed, building my prison one keystroke at a time. But fate, it seems, has a sense of irony that would make even the darkest comedian jealous. The same morning they processed my discharge papers, a notification appeared in my military email. One final assignment before my security clearance was permanently revoked. I'd been reassigned to HQ Evaluation Division, the administrative unit responsible for conducting integrity reviews of senior command staff. It was meant to be a placeholder, a bureaucratic filing cabinet where they could store damaged goods until the paperwork was complete. They had no way of knowing that this particular filing cabinet had teeth. The HQ Evaluation Division existed in the shadows of the Pentagon, 3 floors below the main command levels in a maze of offices that most officers never knew existed. This was where careers went to die quietly, where scandals got buried under mountains of procedure and protocol, where the ugly business of investigating the investigators got handled by people who understood that some truths were too expensive to speak out loud. My new supervisor was Colonel Sarah Chin, a woman whose reputation for thoroughness was matched only by her complete indifference to rank and politics. She looked at me across her cluttered desk on my first day, My personnel file opened between us like a medical chart documenting a terminal diagnosis. "Martinez," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many good officers destroyed by the system they'd sworn to serve. "I don't know what really happened to you, and frankly, I don't care. What I care about is whether you can still do the work. Can you analyze data objectively? Can you follow evidence wherever it leads? Can you write reports that tell the truth even when the truth is inconvenient?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Good," she continued, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "Because we've got a backlog of integrity reviews that stretches back 6 months, and every single one of them involves someone who thinks their rank makes them untouchable. Your job is to prove them wrong." For the first time in weeks, I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest. The work was methodical, painstaking, and absolutely perfect for someone whose life had just been dismantled by fabricated evidence. Every report I reviewed, every timeline I reconstructed, every digital footprint I traced became a masterclass in recognizing the difference between truth and carefully constructed lies. I learned to spot the telltale signs of document manipulation, the subtle inconsistencies that betrayed altered timestamps, the patterns that emerged when someone tried to rewrite history. I worked nights, weekends, holidays, partly because I had nowhere else to go, but mostly because the work was the only thing that made me feel human again. Each case I closed, each corrupt officer I helped remove from command, each lie I unraveled felt like a small victory against the system that had tried to erase me. But the universe, it turns out, was saving the best for last. 3 months into my exile in the evaluation division, Colonel Chin dropped a file on my desk that made my blood freeze in my veins. Admiral Richard Cole was being reviewed for promotion to 4 stars, the kind of advancement that would make him one of the most powerful officers in the entire military. The review was routine, or it should have been. But something about his financial disclosures had triggered an automated flag in the system, a minor inconsistency that warranted closer examination. I stared at that file for what felt like hours, my hands trembling as I opened the cover and saw his face smiling back at me from an official photograph. The same face that had watched me get arrested, the same smile that had convinced me I could trust him, the same eyes that had shown me exactly what betrayal looked like when it was wearing 3 stars and a flag pin. But I didn't let emotion guide my investigation. I couldn't afford to. Every document I reviewed, every transaction I traced, every connection I followed had to be bulletproof because I knew that anything less would be dismissed as the desperate revenge fantasy of a disgraced officer. So I worked with the cold precision of a surgeon, dissecting his career one piece at a time, looking for the patterns that would reveal the truth. That's when I found it. Buried in a routine security audit from 8 months earlier was a digital signature that made my entire world stop spinning. The timestamp on Admiral Cole's authorization code showed him accessing classified mission files at 11:47 p.m. on the night Operation Neptune's Gate was compromised, the same operation he'd used to destroy my career, the same security breach he'd blamed on me. The same hand that wrote my downfall had signed his own evaluation form. But that was just the beginning. Once I knew what to look for, the evidence unfolded like a map leading straight to his door. Financial irregularities that coincided with classified briefings. Unauthorized access to personnel files for officers who'd later been reassigned or discharged. A pattern of document modifications that traced back to his personal computer. And at the center of it all, like a spider in a web of corruption, was the man who'd called himself my mentor while planning my destruction. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call friends or toast with champagne or dance around my tiny apartment like some discount action hero. I simply prepared. Because I knew that when the time came, I would only get one shot at this, and it had to be perfect. The irony was so beautiful it almost made me believe in divine justice. While I was building an airtight case against the man who'd destroyed my life, HQ issued a directive that would have made Shakespeare weep with appreciation for its poetic elegance. Admiral Richard Cole was to appear before the Command Integrity Board for a comprehensive evaluation review, not because anyone suspected him of wrongdoing, but because his promotion to 4 stars required the highest level of clearance verification. He believed it was a formality, a rubber stamp on a career that had been building toward this moment for decades. The evaluation was scheduled as a routine promotion review, the kind of ceremonial procedure that high-ranking officers endured before ascending to the pinnacle of military power. His staff probably spent weeks preparing talking points and polishing his service record, confident that this was nothing more than a final checkpoint before his ultimate triumph. But the universe had other plans. As the lead investigator on his financial review, I was assigned to present the preliminary findings to the evaluation board. Standard procedure dictated that any anomalies discovered during a promotion review be addressed before final approval could be granted. What Admiral Cole didn't know was that those minor financial inconsistencies had led me straight into the heart of his corruption, and that the woman he'd tried to bury was now the one person standing between him and everything he'd ever wanted. I spent the night before the evaluation in my office, reviewing every piece of evidence one final time. Not because I was unsure of the facts, the case against him was ironclad, supported by digital forensics and documented proof that even his expensive lawyers wouldn't be able to explain away. I reviewed it because I wanted to remember every detail, every lie, every moment of betrayal that had led us both to this room. He came dressed in triumph, polished medals, perfect smile, unaware that the walls of that room were built from his own lies. The morning of the evaluation, I arrived at the Pentagon before dawn, walking through corridors that had once felt like home, but now seemed like foreign territory. The Command Integrity Board met in a secure conference room on the 5th floor, a windowless space designed for conversations that could never see daylight. I arranged my files on the table with surgical precision, each document positioned exactly where I would need it when the moment came. At 0800 hours sharp, the board members filed in 3 admirals and 2 generals whose combined service record represented over a century of military leadership. They took their seats with the practiced efficiency of people who'd conducted thousands of these reviews, confident that this would be just another routine evaluation in a career full of routine evaluations. Colonel Chen entered next, taking her position as the administrative coordinator for the proceedings. She caught my eye for just a moment, and I saw something there that might have been understanding, or perhaps recognition of what was about to unfold. She'd been in this business long enough to recognize the difference between standard procedure and surgical precision. Then the door opened one final time. Admiral Richard Cole stepped into that room like he was walking into his own coronation, every inch the decorated hero that decades of careful image management had created. 3 stars gleamed on his collar, ribbons and medals caught the fluorescent light like armor, and that famous smile, the one that had convinced me to trust him, the one that had sealed my fate, spread across his face like he was greeting old friends. His eyes swept the room with practiced confidence, acknowledging each board member with the subtle nods and careful eye contact that marked him as a man comfortable in the presence of power. This was his element, his natural habitat, the arena where he'd built his reputation and accumulated his influence. He moved like someone who'd never doubted his right to be in that room, never questioned his worthiness for the honors about to be bestowed upon him. And then his gaze reached me. The change was instantaneous and absolute. His smile didn't fade so much as shatter, like glass hitting concrete. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might collapse. His eyes, those same eyes that had looked right through me while security dragged me away, went wide with something that looked like terror. For years, he'd commanded me to stand at attention. Now he couldn't stand at all. I looked up calmly, my voice steady and professional as I delivered the words that would change everything. Admiral Cole, take a seat. Silence. No music, no dramatic soundtrack, just his ragged breathing and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The board members exchanged glances, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Colonel Chen's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was beginning to piece together the larger picture. Admiral Cole stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, his mind clearly struggling to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. The woman he'd destroyed, the career he'd ended, the life he'd discarded, sitting at the center of the evaluation table with the power to determine his fate. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no words emerging from the throat that had once delivered his lies with such practiced eloquence. "Admiral," I repeated, my tone remaining perfectly professional, "please take your seat so we can begin the evaluation process." He stumbled forward like a man walking to his own execution, his legs seeming to forget how to function properly. When he finally collapsed into the chair across from me, the sound of his breathing was the loudest thing in the room. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his hands trembled as he attempted to arrange his files on the table. The moment our eyes really locked, not the practiced acknowledgement of rank and protocol, but the raw recognition of hunter and prey, something fundamental shifted in the universe. For months, I'd been the victim in this story, the woman whose life he'd shattered with his lies and manipulation. But in that instant, in that perfect crystallization of cosmic justice, the roles reversed completely. He'd spent months crafting a lie strong enough to bury me, but not strong enough to survive the light. "Admiral Cole," I began, opening the file that contained his professional obituary, "this review has been initiated to address certain irregularities that have come to light during your promotion evaluation. I'm Lieutenant Commander Martinez, and I'll be presenting the findings of our investigation." I watched his face as I spoke my name, saw the way his eyes widened as the full scope of his situation became clear. He wasn't just facing an integrity review, he was facing judgment from the woman he'd tried to erase, delivered by the very system he'd manipulated to serve his purposes. The irony was so perfect it felt like poetry. "Before we proceed," I continued, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who held all the cards, "I want to establish the timeline we'll be examining. Our investigation covers the period from January through October of this year, with particular focus on your involvement in Operation Neptune's Gate and the subsequent security review that followed." At the mention of Neptune's Gate, his face went ashen. He knew what was coming now, understood that the carefully constructed narrative he'd built was about to crumble under the weight of actual evidence. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit who'd probably been confident this would be a routine formality, began shuffling through his papers with the desperate energy of someone realizing his client was about to be fed to wolves. "The investigation began," I explained to the board, "when automated financial screening software flagged unusual patterns in Admiral Cole's disclosure forms. However, as our analysis deepened, we uncovered evidence of much more serious violations." I turned to the first exhibit, a digital forensics report that traced his access to classified systems. At 11:47 p.m. on March 15th, Admiral Cole's authorization code was used to access Operation Neptune's Gate mission files from his personal computer. I let that sink in for a moment, watching as the board members began to understand the implications. For context, I continued, March 15th was 12 hours before the security breach that compromised that operation was discovered. It was also 15 hours before Lieutenant Commander Martinez, that's me, was arrested for allegedly causing that same breach. The silence in the room was deafening. Admiral Cole's breathing had become so labored it sounded like he was drowning in his own guilt. One of the board members, a gray-haired admiral whose reputation for integrity was legendary, leaned forward with the expression of a man who was beginning to see the true shape of what we were dealing with. "Admiral Cole," I said, sliding a document across the table, "this is a copy of the security log from that evening. Can you explain why your access code appears in these records?" He stared at the paper like it was a poisonous snake, his hands shaking too violently to pick it up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. There must be some mistake. I was at home that evening. I never accessed those files. I nodded calmly and turned to the next exhibit. That's interesting, Admiral, because we also have the digital signature from your home computer, time-stamped to match this access log exactly. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life, displaying the forensic analysis that would destroy him. Your personal laptop, using your personal internet connection, connected to secure military servers and downloaded classified mission parameters for an operation you weren't authorized to access. His lawyer finally found his voice. Admiral Cole has been the victim of sophisticated cyber intrusion. His systems were clearly compromised by hostile actors seeking to. Mr. Davidson, I interrupted, not even looking at the lawyer. We've considered that possibility. That's why we expanded our investigation to include a comprehensive analysis of Admiral Cole's digital footprint over the past 18 months. Another document joined the growing pile on the table. What we found was a pattern of unauthorized access spanning multiple operations, multiple security breaches, and multiple officers who were subsequently disciplined for crimes they didn't commit. The room felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Admiral Cole was staring at me with the desperate intensity of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. The board members were exchanging looks that spoke volumes about where this evaluation was headed. Even his lawyer had gone silent, probably calculating how quickly he could distance himself from this disaster. The evidence shows, I continued, my voice never wavering from its professional tone, that Admiral Cole has been systematically accessing classified information without authorization, using that information for personal gain, and then framing subordinate officers for the security breaches his own actions created. I turned to face him directly, allowing years of pain and rage to burn in my eyes while my voice remained perfectly controlled. He didn't just steal classified information. He stole careers. He stole lives. He stole the honor of officers who trusted him to lead them. That's when he finally broke. You don't understand, he screamed, his composure shattering like glass. You have no idea what kind of pressure I was under. The decisions I had to make. The sacrifices. He was on his feet now, pointing at me with a trembling finger. You think you can sit there in judgment of me? You were nothing. A data technician who got lucky. I made you. I gave you everything you ever had. The silence that followed his outburst was absolute and damning. Even his lawyer was staring at him in horror, probably realizing that his client had just confessed to everything in a room full of witnesses. The board members looked like they were watching a man commit professional suicide in real time. I remained perfectly calm, my hands folded in front of me like I was discussing the weather. Admiral Cole, are you confessing to the charges outlined in this report? He seemed to realize what he'd just done, his face cycling through expressions of rage, terror, and desperate calculation. But it was too late. The words were out, witnessed and recorded, and no amount of backpedaling could stuff them back into his throat. I need to speak with my attorney, he stammered, collapsing back into his chair. Of course, I replied smoothly. But first, let me finish presenting the evidence. I turned back to the board, my voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The investigation reveals that Admiral Cole manipulated security logs, falsified witness statements, and used his command authority to destroy the careers of at least 7 officers who posed no security threat whatsoever. His actions represent the most serious breach of command integrity this board has ever reviewed. I slid the final document across the table, a complete reconstruction of his crimes, supported by digital forensics and cross-referenced with the destroyed careers of his victims. The evidence is conclusive. Admiral Cole is guilty of treason, fraud, abuse of power, and conduct unbecoming an officer. I recommend immediate court-martial and dishonorable discharge. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Admiral Cole sat slumped in his chair like a broken puppet, all the fight drained out of him by the weight of his own lies finally coming home to roost. His lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to his own reputation when this story hit the press. But then something unexpected happened. As I looked at him sitting there, this man who'd been my mentor, my father figure, my destroyer, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something close to it. Maybe it was seeing him so completely defeated, so utterly broken by the consequences of his own choices. Maybe it was recognizing that his downfall didn't actually heal the wounds he'd inflicted on me. Maybe it was just the exhaustion of carrying so much rage for so many months. Or maybe it was my father's voice, echoing from somewhere deep in my memory. Power isn't proved by destroying others, it's proved by what you choose not to destroy. I looked at the board members, all of them waiting for me to deliver the final blow that would end his career in disgrace and probably land him in a federal prison for the rest of his life. I had everything I needed to destroy him completely, to make him pay for every moment of pain he'd caused me and every other officer he'd sacrificed to protect his own ambitions. I had the power to give him exactly what he deserved. Instead, I chose something different. However, I continued, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I want to recommend an alternative to court-martial proceedings. The board members looked surprised, and Admiral Cole's head snapped up with something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes. Given Admiral Cole's long service record and the classified nature of much of this evidence, I believe the interests of justice and national security would be better served by allowing him to retire immediately with full benefits intact. The room erupted in whispered conversations as board members tried to process what I was saying. Admiral Cole stared at me like I'd just performed a miracle, his eyes wide with disbelief and desperate gratitude. Even his lawyer looked confused, probably wondering if this was some kind of elaborate trap. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, the senior board member, interrupted. Are you saying that despite the severity of these charges, you're recommending we allow Admiral Cole to retire with honor? I met his gaze steadily. I'm recommending that we allow him to retire quietly, without the public spectacle of a court-martial that would damage the reputation of the service he's spent 30 years serving. Admiral Cole has committed serious crimes, but destroying him publicly won't undo the damage he's caused. It will only create more damage. I turned back to Admiral Cole, seeing the man he used to be underneath the monster he'd become. What Admiral Cole did to me and the other officers under his command was inexcusable. But I won't become him. I won't use my power to destroy someone just because I can. The vote was unanimous. Admiral Richard Cole would retire immediately, his promotion to 4 stars permanently denied, his access to classified information revoked forever. He would leave the military quietly, without fanfare or ceremony, carrying the weight of his crimes in silence for the rest of his life. As the board members filed out and the lawyers packed their briefcases, Admiral Cole sat alone at the table for a long moment, staring at the documents that had outlined his professional obituary. When he finally stood to leave, he stopped at my chair and looked down at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before, not manipulation, not calculation, but simple human recognition. Martinez, he said quietly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and defeat. Thank you. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He'd made his choices, and I'd made mine, and the distance between us was measured in more than just the space across that conference room. He walked toward the door with the careful steps of a man who'd aged decades in the span of a few hours. But just before he reached the exit, he stopped and turned back one final time. Then, slowly and deliberately, he raised his hand in a perfect military salute, not the mechanical gesture of rank and protocol, but the heartfelt tribute of one warrior acknowledging another. For the first time in our entire relationship, Admiral Richard Cole was saluting me out of respect, not rank. I returned the salute, holding it until he dropped his hand and walked out of my life forever. 6 months later, I was promoted to lead evaluator for command integrity, the youngest officer ever to hold that position. My first initiative was the creation of new protocols for investigating command misconduct, procedures designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had destroyed my career and so many others. The reforms were officially designated as the Martinez Protocol, a name that would appear on every integrity investigation for years to come. Every lie he told built the law that now guards the truth. But late at night, when I'm alone in my office reviewing cases and protecting officers who will never know my name, I sometimes think about that moment when our eyes locked across the evaluation table. The moment when he realized that the woman he'd tried to bury had become the person writing his evaluation. The moment when all his careful plans and calculated betrayals collapsed under the weight of a single, cosmic irony. He framed me for failure. But in the end, his own lies became my evidence. The truth is, I don't hate him anymore. Hate requires too much energy, and I have better things to do with my life than carry around the poison of someone else's choices. What I feel now is something closer to pity for a man who had everything and threw it away because he couldn't stand watching someone else succeed. But I'll never forget the lesson he taught me, even though he didn't mean to teach it. Power corrupts, but it doesn't have to. Leadership is a choice, and every day I wake up and choose to be the kind of officer he never was, the kind who lifts people up instead of tearing them down, who protects the truth instead of manipulating it, who understands that real strength comes from building something better, not destroying what already exists. He tried to bury my name, but forgot that I was the one writing his evaluation. And when our eyes locked, he finally saw the rank he could never fake. The rank of someone who chooses honor over revenge, truth over convenience, justice over personal satisfaction. The rank of someone who understands that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's becoming everything your enemy tried to prevent you from being. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment your city or country below, because justice doesn't scream, it signs the report.